Welcome to the final video in the sections of the NIPAD. We're now on to section 2, which is going to look at assessment, namely the formative and summative assessment. So let's start with formative assessment. The formative assessment is a tripartite assessment that occurs with the practice assessor, the linked lecturer or practice tutor, and the student at approximately halfway through the practice learning for that part of the program. So if that part of the program has 20 weeks of practice learning, then the formative assessment will occur around week 10. It can be maybe a week either side of that. And the purpose really of this formative assessment is to provide formative feedback to the student and give them direction in preparing them for their summative assessment. Now there is detailed guidance within the NIPAD handbook which should be consulted as well. The first part is really for the practice assessor to identify if there are any highlighted concerns in the NIPAD to date, and if there are, if there's a sufficient development or action plan in place. It's also a point where all records of discussions need to be verified as being complete and authenticated, and all evidence authenticated. And at this point, it really is about seeing, is there sufficient progress for the stage of this part of the course? So for example, if the student produces an NIPAD that really is missing nearly all of the evidence, has lots of gaps in it, that doesn't have complete records of discussions, that will be picked up at this point and saying there's not sufficient progress. Equally, a student may have an abundance of evidence developed, may be ahead of where you would expect them to be halfway through that part of the program, and you'd be quite happy to say yes, they are showing sufficient progress. So at this formative assessment then, the practice assessor and the linked lecturer will both record comments to verify in summary the student's progress. So if they're happy, if there's any concerns, if there's no concerns, what the key areas for development going forward are. Say for example, student still hasn't tackled much of their care documentation or reflections, you might highlight that, or you might note that actually they're ahead of where you expect them to be. The student will also record their comments, and the student will say how they feel they're progressing, and that will give the linked lecturer, practice tutor and the practice assessor some insight into that student's insight into their own progress. If we look now at the summative assessment, there are 2 attempts at summative assessment, and summative assessment occurs at the end of the practice learning period for that part. So in the final experience, it will occur towards the end, but it must leave a minimum period of 2 weeks for a second attempt. The summative assessment, as I said, is tripartite, so it occurs with the practice assessor, the academic assessor, and the student. Again, there is detailed guidance within the NIPAD handbook, and you're encouraged to go and to read that in advance of undertaking a summative assessment. So the first part is for the practice assessor to confirm that all the professional values and attributes in the professional values and practice template have been achieved. So if they have been achieved, that's great, and if they've not been achieved, then the concerns must be noted. And then in considering the evidence, then the practice assessor will be going through all the components of evidence within the NIPAD to verify that all the proficiencies have been achieved. So for example, they will confirm that all the professional values and practices have been completed and achieved, that there has been 3 sets of service user care feedback and that they've all been achieved without any issues, that the authenticated reflections have all been done and all the indicated proficiencies have been achieved, and the same for all the other forms of evidence that are listed. So you're considering the types of evidence and you're considering that the related proficiencies have all been achieved and authenticated. so that there are no gaps anywhere in all the evidence required in the NIPAD for that part. If there are gaps, then you tick a not yet achieved. You should also identify whether all the records of discussions to date have been complete and authenticated, and that the student has completed their practice learning evaluation. So at this point, the student is required to have completed their evaluation of their practice learning experiences to date. If any of the above then are not achieved or are incomplete, then we have to complete the action plan to achieve proficiencies not yet achieved, which we'll go to on the next page. If all are achieved, you tick the box then to say that this is not applicable. And at that point then, if everything has been achieved, you can recommend the above named student progresses to part 2 of the programme. If there are gaps, then you tick that you do not recommend. Again, if they are achieving, everything has been achieved, you can tick the not applicable box there as well. The practice assessor then will sign, and they will confirm in doing so that they are an NMC registrant with the appropriate equivalent experience for the student's field of practice. Still on the first attempt of summative assessment, the academic assessor must also confirm that at the time of assessment the above student may progress to the next part of the programme subject to ratification at the Board of Examiners in line with the course regulations. So effectively, if they're saying yes, everything that the practice assessor has signed off has been signed off, everything, all the evidence is there, and that there's nothing that would prevent this student from progressing to the next stage of the programme subject to the regulations of the programme being met at an examination board. So they tick yes if that's the case, no if not, that's not the case, and they'll also be confirming that they're an NMC registrant with appropriate equivalent experience for the student's field of practice. The practice assessor and academic assessor and the student will all then write a comment based really as a summary of the assessment process, and these are not to be left blank, they must be completed at the time of the summative assessment. Now, if the student has not achieved, then the agreed action plan must be completed. So this is to address any of the deficits that were identified up above. So if there are not yet achieved here or no's, then they must be picked up and addressed in an agreed action plan where the learning and development needs are set out for the next minimum 2-week period and how they will be achieved. And they will be signed off and agreed by the practice assessor, the academic assessor, and by the student. The date for review will also be agreed at that point. Once the student has had a minimum of 2 weeks to attempt to address any of the deficits identified in their first attempt at summative assessment, then they will have a final attempt at summative assessment. Again, this is a tripartite summative assessment and must occur with the practice assessor, the academic assessor, and the student. The first part of that will be to note which type of evidence there was a deficit in evidence, and then it will be a case of looking at whether that deficit has now been met and that the required evidence is now present, authenticated, and to standard, which you'll see down here. Also, you will confirm that all records of discussions to date have been completed and authenticated, and that the student has completed their practice learning evaluation. If that deficit in evidence that was present in the first attempt is now been resolved, then the student can be recommended to progress to part 2 of the programme. If the student has not met that deficit, then let's tick that they are not recommended to progress, and the details of where they know from here must be recorded in this section here. So if you've ticked a no here to say I do not recommend them, but rather I tick yes here and I do not recommend to progress, then you must provide the details of where that deficit still exists. The practice assessor then will sign and authenticate their NMC registrant with the appropriate equivalent experience. Again, the academic assessor will again look at the evidence and the assessment with the practice assessor and confirm and recommend whether the student may progress to the next part of the programme, subject to ratification at the Board of Examiners and in line with the course regulation, or not progress, and will also verify that they're an NMC registrant with the appropriate equivalent experience for the student's field of practice. Again, comments from the practice assessor, academic assessor and student must be recorded, and that may be to say that, you know, a summary of the assessment to say that everything's now present and correct and needed to be, and everything's okay, and that's great. Or it may be just to again expand on the fact that the evidence is not present, that all the proficiencies for that part of the programme have not been met, and provides the details around that. This now concludes the videos for the NIPAD. Again, please remember the resources that you have to learn about the NIPAD some more, and that includes the details in the NIPAD handbook. And you also, if you are in the Health and Social Care Trusts, have access to your practice education teams. And if you're in the independent sector, you will be able to get that same support through your link lecturer or practice tutor, and in both settings you will have the support of the link lecturers and practice tutors. Again, if you're a student, you will be able to access the support from your link lecturer, practice tutor, and from those people who lead up practice learning from your university as well.